Hey there, Timberwolves. Miss Robolino coming in with a quick asynchronous lesson for Friday, September 10th and Monday, September 13th. So as you walked into class, you should have grabbed the Cabesa de Vaca DBQ. DBQ stands for document-based questions. So a document-based question is going to be questions that you are answering from primary source and secondary source documents. Before you go ahead and dive into the DBQs, I want to go ahead and go over what are primary and secondary sources. Having an understanding of what they are and how to read them will make it much easier for you to go ahead and complete the document-based questions. So let's go ahead and let's dive in. So what I'd like to go over first is a primary source. So here I'm explaining a primary source is going to be an original object document about a first-hand information. Primary source is going to be material written or produced in that time period. So if you're looking at the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence was written in the 1700s, and it's going to go ahead and be written at like the people wrote back then. So it's considered a primary source. The Declaration of Independence also has the ideologies and the political beliefs of what government should be and how it should look like. So how we view it today is going to be much different than how it was viewed back then. So primary sources enable researchers to get close and to actually understand how life was like during that time period. Primary sources are one of my favorite things to analyze because having the background knowledge about it is going to make it very interesting of how people were in the past. So some examples of primary sources would be like journals, like Diary of Anne Frank. Another one could be an autobiography. An autobiography is when a person writes about their own life, like Nelson Mandela and his autobiography. Another primary source could be speeches. Speeches were given during that time period that talk about political or maybe social ideologies of that time, such as Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, the first inauguration from George Washington, or Abraham Lincoln's and his Gettysburg Address, each one happening at different time periods and having different ideas that talk about what life was like in that historical era. Primary sources could also be any of these listed here, like your birth certificate. That was created on the day you were born. That's a primary source. Tax records, census records, any of these things can be considered primary sources. How about looking at published firsthand accounts of stories or newspapers, primary sources, such as the presidential election with those results? Those would be considered primary sources. Or how about the televised the televised stations of footage of specific things happening at the time, like maybe a sports game, anything like that. Primary sources could also be sound recordings, like a song. Songs are considered primary sources. When you think about what songs are now compared to in the past, they're very different. Primary sources are also mainly what you're familiar with are photographs and videos, like documentaries. So photographs here are going to be of World War II. Taking a look at the pictures, you're going to see that it's very different. How one person perceives the photos is going to be different how another perceives the photos. Now, that's why primary sources can be very tricky. So the same holds true for videos and film created during an event. A film was made interviewing President Bush. That film would be considered a primary source because it's happening at that time. Your movies that you guys like to watch about wars or maybe the Holocaust, or maybe you're into the colonial era, all of those are going to be researched heavily by primary sources. And that's how screenwriters write their scripts, based off the past. So primary sources could also be letters written between families, soldiers writing home to their loved ones, what they wrote about, what they talked about, give a glimpse of what it was like. So advantages of primary sources are going to be giving a look at that time period, access to records of artistic, social, scientific, and political ideologies of that time period. Kind of tells us how people lived. It also gives a unique personal ideology and a sense of what it's like in that part of the past. And that can be very interesting. Think about what it would be like in the 1600s compared to today. Do you think the person in the 1600s, if they came and saw the 21st century, they'd probably be very scared, looking at how religious they were and how they dressed? They probably would think what we were wearing was considered undergarments or pajamas compared to what they wore. So again, primary sources give us a look. Some disadvantages of primary sources, as I mentioned before, is how one interprets them. Primary sources can have bias. Bias means when you favor one side more, and maybe the purpose of why you wrote it and your point of view. All of these are going to give challenges that hinder how someone is able to interpret what a primary source is. Some primary sources are burned or they're incomplete, and it makes it hard to study them. So it's important to go ahead and use multiple primary sources to go ahead and back yourself up on your ideas and also find patterns. So primary sources is what you're going to be looking at in the DBQ. I also want to introduce secondary sources because we work with secondary sources all the time. A secondary source is something written about a primary source, which means if you were to look at a photo and write about that photo, that would be a secondary source because you're taking the primary source and you're giving your own interpretation about it. Usually an author of a secondary source will have studied that particular historical era. So they are considered experts or they have a good knowledge of that background. So they can go ahead and write very well about what life was like. Some examples of secondary sources would be encyclopedias, history books, your textbook. Secondary sources are all going to be these because they're written after the events occurred. For example, if you're going to write a paper about the Holocaust, you're going to look at maybe letters, some documentaries, pictures. Maybe you're going to look at some census of what happens to the Jewish population in Germany and parts of Europe, and you can go ahead and write about that. Your written report is going to be a secondary source because it's based off primary sources. So you're putting facts in there. Secondary sources are really important, and I'm going to kind of explain it in this way. I want you to think about this. If I tell you something, I'm the primary source because I'm giving it to you. It's coming from my mouth. But if you take what I said and pass it on to someone else, it's a secondary source now because you're taking what I said and you're giving your own spin on what I said. So again, it's not exact word for word. However, if you were to take a quote and say it word for word and share it with someone, it would be a primary source. I hope that kind of explains things a little to you. So what are some advantages of primary sources? Well, they have been evaluated and been looked at and interpreted for years and years to come. So they're usually very accurate. And again, depending on where it's coming from. Secondary sources are best for uncovering the historical context or the background about a topic. If you wanted to write a paper about Galileo, you'd probably have to understand about the time period in the 16 and the 1400s. That's going to be important because Galileo was put under house arrest for going ahead and saying something so silly at the time. He believed that the sun was the center of the universe. However, people thought it was the earth that was the center of the universe. He said this and he was put under house arrest because they thought he was crazy. So again, something that we consider to be true is going to be allowed in thought, expressing your ideas. But back then, you were penalized for it or you were persecuted because it didn't match what everyone else was thinking. So when you think about that, secondary sources, having that background is going to make it a lot easier for you to understand Galileo's writings, his letters, or maybe his books that he wrote or his theses. Because if you don't understand the time period, you're not going to understand why he's writing what he's writing. Okay, so some disadvantages to secondary sources would be the reliability and validity that are going to be open to question. So often they don't provide exact information. So what if someone interpreted the primary source wrong, right? So they do not represent firsthand knowledge of a subject or event. It's all according to point of view. So how you interpret it can make it very true, or it can make it very poor. So when you think about secondary sources and primary sources, make sure you're reading carefully and you understand the historical context or the background of that time, so you can see if there's any things that are going to be there that aren't going to make any sense. So that is your primary source information. I want to go ahead and take a moment and go over the DBQ with you. So go ahead and grab your DBQ and let's go ahead and let's go over it together. So taking a look here, you can notice that there are different sections of a DBQ. You have the overview. The overview of a DBQ is going to tell you what this whole packet is about. It's important to read. So let's take a look. On June 17th, 1527, Cabeza de Vaca sailed from the Spanish mainland with 600 settlers to establish colonies on the northern shore of Gulf of Mexico. The trip went badly, and within a year, nearly all the men in the expedition were dead. This mini Q is about Cabeza's 8-year struggle to stay alive and his remarkable journey from Florida to the Texas coast, eventually to Mexico City. Here it tells you how many documents there are. There's document A, and document A is going to talk about Cabeza's trek across Texas and Mexico, and it tells you it's a map. Document B is the art of survival. It's going to show you a chart. Document C is the surgeon. Interesting. And document D is we came from where the sun rose. So it's a start of a quote. So these are going to be the documents you're going to be analyzing. Let's go ahead and let's take a look. So here, what you can see is you have your background essay. Now, remember when I told you about having the historical context, understanding the time period? This would be a secondary source. So the background essay is a secondary source. You would read it and look at the picture, and then from there, answer the questions. Here, the questions are going to help you understand the primary sources in document A, B, C, and D. So let's go ahead and let's move on to document A. Take a look at document A. It's a map. Here's the Gulf of Mexico. Here's some mountains, and this is a desert. So here we see, again, look at our maps, the Gulf of California, and we see here these arrows. And these arrows have something here. They tell us things. So we're going to look at it. Now, what do you think this is? If you read the title, it tells you Cabeza's trek, or what he traveled from Texas to Mexico. That means he walked all of this. Interesting. So he wanted to go from here to here. So why didn't he do that? This will tell us. Here it says rumors of unfriendly natives. So he chose not to go this way because it probably would end in his demise. So he decided to go ahead across the desert, go all the way around towards the Pacific Ocean, walk down and get to Mexico City, which was the, as Veracruz, or Mexico City, which was the Aztec capital. What a trip. Oh my goodness. Here it also tells us some information about the years. Take a look. Here this tells us Cabeza arrives in 1536. This also shows us how much he traveled. So maybe you want to take a ruler and measure this and see how many miles he walked. Here it says when he started walking, 1528 to 1536. I don't know about you, but that seems like more than I would want to walk. Okay, so as you can tell, he travels west, goes south, goes west, south, and travels east. Okay, so make sure you look at everything on this map before you go ahead and answer these questions. Take a look at document B. Here it's important to read the source. The source is going to tell you what you're reading. So compiled from the Relación of Alvar Nuez Cabeza de Vaca, 1542, the explorer's personal account of his long adventure. This is from his journal, how he survived. So this means this is a primary source. It's translated. So on October 1528, thirsty, take a look. With other raft survivors adrift in the Gulf of Mexico, Cabeza drank water stored in hollowed out horse leg containers. Ooh, very not something I'd want to drink out of. How about the next one? 1529 to 1532. Periodic hunger. As a slave, Cabeza ate what was available, including berries, mollusks, rats, roots, lizards, snakes, and spiders. Oh my goodness, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't eat spiders. So as you start to read this, is this really a primary source or a secondary source? Interesting. When you take a look at it, it's describing what happened during these years. So this is a secondary source. 1530 to 1532, distrust. 1530 to 1535, communication. 1534, cold and despair. So as you read this, I want you to look at the years and read the responses or what's happening, and then answer these questions here. Document C is going to be, again, read the source and the note. This is the Relación of Alvar Nuez Cabeza de Vaca, 1542. Note, in this excerpt from his narrative, Cabeza describes an operation he performed in 1535 on a Native American living near the Rio Nadores. It is believed to be the first documented surgery done in North America. Take a look at the picture. Oh my goodness. It definitely does not look like something I would want to go through. So let's read. Here they brought me a man, and they told me that a long time ago he had been wounded through the right shoulder with an arrow, and the point of the arrow rested over his heart. With a knife that I had, I opened his chest to that place. I inserted the knife point, and with great difficulty, at last I pulled it out. It was very long and with a deer bone. That was the bow and arrow. It was a deer bone. I gave him 2 stitches, and 2 days later, I removed the 2 stitches from the Indian, and he was healed. And this cure gave us a very great reputation among them throughout the whole land. Wow. So here, this is telling me that Cabeza de Vaca got some respect from the Native Americans. It seems like because he was kind to them and helped them, they seem to respect him throughout the whole land of Texas. So maybe take a look at this and try and answer this. And the last one, document D. Remember, read the note. What does it tell you? Let's take a look. After nearly 7 years of captivity and almost 2 years spent walking west and south, Cabeza made first contact with shocked Spaniards near the Gulf of California. He was with his 3 fellow survivors and following of hundreds of Indians. These Spaniards were on a slave catching expedition and were spreading great fear among the Indian groups along the Pacific coast. In this passage, Cabeza refers to these soldiers as the Christians. Let's read together. We suffered many annoyances and great disputes with the Spaniards. Because they wanted to enslave the Indians we brought with us. The Christians told the Indians that we had been lost for a long time and that we were people of ill fortune and no worth. Isn't that horrible to be considered ill fortune, which means you're bad luck and you're worth nothing? And that they were the lords of the land whom the Indians were to serve and obey. The Indians were not all convinced. Some talked among themselves, saying the Christians were lying because we came from where the sun rose and the Spaniards from where it set, and that we cured the sick and that the Spaniards killed those who were well, and that we came naked and barefoot and they went about dressed and on horses and with lances, and that we did not covert anything, but rather everything. The Indians gave us we later returned, and that the Spaniards had no other objective but to steal everything they found. But to steal everything they found and did not give anything to anyone. Interesting. There's a lot going on here. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. Here, we're talking about the Spanish. They don't seem to care too much about Cabeza de Vaca, right? Here, they're talking about he's bad luck. Let's take a look over here. This is how the Spanish think about themselves. They're saying they're superior over everyone and that the natives should obey them and be their slaves. This part here is saying how the natives felt about the Spanish. They felt they were lying. Okay, so that means there was distrust between the Spanish and the natives. Okay, and here this is looking at Cabeza de Vaca and the Spanish and comparing them, how they met Cabeza de Vaca versus how they meet the Spanish. So they just view it very interesting. Okay, but all in all, this just kind of breaks down the time period. Okay, and then these are the questions that you're going to be answering. And that's the end of the DBQ. So I hope this helps you break down the primary and secondary sources, and you're able to go ahead and answer these questions. You're going to go ahead and read this background essay on your own, and I want you to go ahead and highlight important things in here that are going to help you. Okay. For example, some things I think that would be important would be understanding what a conquistador is, which you know because it's a vocab word, or looking at specific areas of colonization and what is colonization. Okay, and this is going to be able to help you. Make sure you go through, highlight things that you think are important. This DBQ is your copy, it's not a class set. Okay, answer these questions and we'll go from there. All right, y'all, I hope this gives you a great help and you have everything you need to complete this. Remember, the sub is there to help you. And if you have questions, feel free to take your time and watch this video as many times as you need. I look forward to seeing you guys next Friday and good luck. Bye, Timberwolves.